Hi, and welcome to this new video in which we will carry on talking about Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, a brief history of humankind. So in the previous videos, we went over the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, which are two major landmarks in the history of human progress and of human evolution also. So today we will look at the scientific and industrial revolutions that happened 500 years ago. So that is in the 16th century, that they started in the 16th century. And we will see how in this period that we are going to look at through this lecture, how our human species went from Homo sapiens to Homo Economicus. So the 16th century, which is when the scientific revolution started to happen, started to spur progress, additional progress, is defined by an unprecedented acquisition of knowledge and techniques. And this is also when we were able as humans to expand our dominion over nature and over the environment. It's also when we saw the rise of capitalism happening. So states and markets started to outweigh family businesses and small-scale community organizations. And with this massive activity, we saw a greater impact on the environment. So this is also when scientists have been able to observe massive extinctions of species in this period. And there's also another point that is interesting. Starting in the 16th century and later on to an even greater degree, we see the notion of happiness emerging in the mentalities and the philosophies of Western thinkers, okay? So this is kind of when we start to value the idea that every human is somewhat entitled to the pursuit of happiness. That is a major cornerstone in, for example, the early United States constitutions and ideology. So it is linked with the idea of individualism. All right? In this lecture, we will ask ourselves how progress can be measured. What are the criteria or the units that we can use to assess progress at large? Is progress quantifiable? And if it is, in which metrics? If you look at it over the past decades, with, for example, the United Nations come up with a variety of indexes to measure the welfare, the well-being, the economic prosperity of countries with, for example, the GDP, gross domestic product. We measure literacy, life expectancy, median income, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, human rights, and so on. To the point where some other countries, such as Bhutan, for example, shot back with another index they came up with on their own, which is GDH, gross domestic happiness, exposing the limits of these indexes and measurements and criteria of the welfare and the well-being of nations. So we can see with all this that it is quite difficult to measure accurately, consistently, and objectively the well-being of a whole society. But let's try and take a look at some figures, comparing our era nowadays to that of 500 years ago. So we will start with a comparison between year 1500 and 2012. So let me read for you a paragraph of Harari's book about this. So he writes, "The last 500 years have witnessed a phenomenal and unprecedented growth in human power. In the year 1500, there were about 500 million Homo sapiens in the entire world. Today, there are 7 billion. The total value of goods and services produced by humankind in the year 1500 is estimated at $250 billion in today's dollars. Nowadays, the value of a year of human production is close to $60 trillion. In 1500, humanity consumed about 13 trillion calories of energy per day. Today, we consume 1,500 trillion calories a day. Unquote. So, of course, the cognitive and agricultural revolution played a huge part in this exponential growth, right? But it was further catalyzed by the scientific and industrial revolutions which happened later. So I have skipped the portions of Harari's book about where he talks about the importance of religion, but it doesn't mean they should be disregarded. So keep in mind, even though we won't go very deeply into this, that religion played a huge part in this whole phenomenon. Okay, so 500 years ago, this overall process really accelerated significantly with what we call the scientific revolution. We made remarkable progress in terms of medicine, biology, technology. We augmented our production abilities and capacities in the span of only a few decades, which is a very short time span relatively to the whole history of humans on Earth. So let me carry on with another quote from the book. He says, "For most of history, humans knew nothing about 99.99% of the organisms on the planet, namely the microorganisms. This was not because they were of no concern to us. Each of us bears billions of one-celled creatures within us, and not just as free riders. They are our best friends and deadliest enemies. Some of them digest our food and clean our guts, while others cause illnesses and epidemics. Yet, it was only in 1674 that a human eye first saw a microorganism, when Anton van Leeuwenhoek took a peek through his homemade microscope and was startled to see an entire world of tiny creatures milling about in a drop of water. During the subsequent 300 years, humans have made the acquaintance of a huge number of microscopic species. We've managed to defeat most of the deadliest contagious diseases they cause and have harnessed microorganisms in the service of medicine and industry. Today, we engineer bacteria to produce medications, manufacture biofuel, and kill parasites." Unquote. And further down, Harari highlights one important and irreversible consequence of this progress. He says, "But the single most remarkable and defining moment of the past 500 years came at 5 a.m., 29 minutes, 45 seconds, on 16th of July, 1945. At that precise second, American scientists detonated the first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico. From that point onward, humankind had the capability not only to change the course of history, but to end it." Unquote. Progress thus depends on a certain stability between several factors of human population organizations. Harari says that science needs more than just research to make progress. It depends on the mutual reinforcement of science, politics, and economics. Political and economic institutions provide the resources without which scientific research is almost impossible. In return, scientific research provides new powers that are used, among other things, to obtain new resources, some of which are reinvested in research. Why did humans develop a growing belief in their ability to obtain new powers through research? What forged the bond between science, politics, and economics? This chapter looks at the unique nature of modern science in order to provide part of the answer. Unquote. Harari then proceeds to examining the formation of the alliance between science, the European empires, and the economics of capitalism, which illustrates in the notion of investment. So he writes, "Humans have sought to understand the universe, at least since the cognitive revolution. Our ancestors put a great deal of time and effort into trying to discover the rules that govern the natural world. But modern science differs from all previous traditions of knowledge in 3 critical ways. A. The willingness to admit ignorance. Modern science is based on the Latin injunction, ignoramus, we do not know. It assumes that we don't know everything. Even more critically, it accepts that the things that we think we know could be proven wrong as we gain more knowledge. No concept, idea, or theory is sacred and beyond challenge. B. The centrality of observation and mathematics. Having admitted ignorance, modern science aims to obtain new knowledge. It does so by gathering observations and then using mathematical tools to connect these observations into comprehensive theories. And C. The acquisition of new powers. Modern science is not content with creating theories. It uses these theories in order to acquire new powers, and in particular to develop new technologies. And Harari concludes that the scientific revolution has not been a revolution of knowledge. It has been, above all, a revolution of ignorance. The great discovery that launched the scientific revolution was the discovery that humans do not know the answers to their most important questions. Unquote. So what really changed from the 15th century was the lens the Western thinkers placed on science and observation of the world. In Europe, it was the era of the Renaissance. The Renaissance era is commonly defined as an intellectual, cultural, and artistic movement which shifted the consideration of the human individual as a mere cog in the immense mechanism controlled by an almighty God to a central consideration of the existence. The individual thus became the core of social preoccupations and concerns. A bit later, with the Enlightenment, the idea of happiness was completely reinvented and used as an argument for new ideologies and political orders. Scientific and medical research had long been hindered due to a certain set of circumstances, religious and theoretical dogma. But on the scientific level, what the Renaissance and Enlightenment brought about was a new interpretation of the benefits science had the potential to give us on an individual level. Science was now considered something that had to be deployed and invested in to enhance the human experience on Earth and make it easier, more comfortable. It was about living in good conditions. It was no longer about surviving, but it was about living a happy life. This is when in Europe the idea of happiness was put under a new light and tied closely to the idea of progress. One Englishman here is important to be mentioned, Lord Francis Bacon. He was one of the leading figures in natural philosophy and in the field of scientific methodology in the period of transition from the Renaissance to the early modern era. As a lawyer, member of Parliament, and Queen's Counsel, Lord Bacon wrote on questions of law, state, and religion, as well as on contemporary politics, but he also published texts in which he speculated on possible conceptions of society, and he pondered questions of ethics in essays. Even in his works on natural philosophy, the advancement of learning. About this Lord Bacon, Harari writes, in 1620, Francis Bacon published a scientific manifesto, cited the new instrument, Novum Organum. In it, he argued that knowledge is power. The real test of knowledge is not whether it is true, but whether it empowers us. Scientists usually assume that no theory is 100% correct. Consequently, truth is a poor test for knowledge. The real test is utility. A theory that enables us to do new things constitutes knowledge. Unquote. Francis Bacon's theory was a theory according to which humans have a divine mandate to govern and exploit the earth and uncover the mysteries of its natural laws, to use them to our advantage. In his manifesto, he urged scientists to let go of Aristotle's traditional outdated method. He wanted to found England's empirical science. It was about moving from the scholastic deductive approach to the inductive approach, the approach of empiricism. He uses an interesting analogy, and here I'm quoting from his Novum Organum work, The New Instrument. He wrote, "Those who have handled sciences have been either men of experiment or men of dogmas. The men of experiment are like the ant, they only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders, who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and of the field, but transforms and digests it by a power of its own. Not unlike this is the true business of philosophy, for it neither relies on solely or chiefly on the powers of the mind, nor does it take the matter which it gathers from natural history and mechanical experiments and lay it up in the memory whole, as it finds it, but lays it up in the understanding altered and digested. Therefore, from a closer and purer league between these two faculties, the experimental and the rational, such has never been made, much may be hoped." And Harari says, "Over the centuries, science has offered us many new tools. Some are mental tools, such as those used to predict death rates and economic growth. Even more important are technological tools. The connection forged between science and technology is so strong that today people tend to confuse the two. We often think that it is impossible to develop new technologies without scientific research, and that there is little point in research if it does not result in new technologies. In fact, the relationship between science and technology is a very recent phenomenon. Prior to 1500, science and technology were totally separate fields. When Bacon connected the two in the early 17th century, it was a revolutionary idea. During the 17th and 18th century, this relationship tightened, but the knot was tied only in the 19th century. Even in 1800, most rulers who wanted a strong army, and most business magnates who wanted a successful business did not bother to finance research in physics, biology, or economics." Unquote. Here's another passage of the book. "Until the scientific revolution, most human cultures did not believe in progress. They thought the golden age was in the past, and that the world was stagnant, if not deteriorating. Strict adherence to the wisdom of the ages might perhaps bring back the good old times, and human ingenuity might conceivably improve this or that facet of daily life. Even if Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, and Confucius, who knew everything there is to know, were unable to abolish famine, disease, poverty, and war from the world, how could we expect to do so? Many faiths believe that someday a Messiah would appear and end all wars, famines, and even death itself. But the notion that humankind could do so by discovering new knowledge and inventing new tools was worse than ludicrous. It was hubris. The story of the Tower of Babel, story of Icarus, the story of the Golem, and countless other myths taught people that any attempt to go beyond limitations would inevitably lead to disappointment and disaster. When modern culture admitted that there were many important things that it still did not know, and when that admission of ignorance was married to the idea that scientific discoveries could give us new powers, people began suspecting that real progress might be possible after all. As science began to solve one unsolvable problem after another, many became convinced that humankind could overcome any and every problem by acquiring and applying new knowledge. Poverty, sickness, wars, famines, old age, and death itself were not the inevitable fate of humankind. They were simply the fruits of our ignorance. And later on, he talks about how we moved from observation of the environment to conquest of the environment. So here's another passage. Modern science flourished in and thanks to European empires. The discipline obviously owes a huge debt to ancient scientific traditions such as those of classical Greece, China, India, and Islam. Yet its unique character began to take shape only in the early modern period, hand in hand with the imperial expansion of Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. During the early modern period, Chinese, Indians, Muslim, Native Americans, and Polynesians continued to make important contributions to the scientific revolution. The insights of Muslim economists were studied by Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Treatments pioneered by Native American doctors found their way into English medical texts, and data extracted from Polynesian informants revolutionized Western anthropology. But until the mid-20th century, the people who collated these myriad scientific discoveries, creating scientific disciplines in the process, were the ruling and intellectual elites of the global European empires. The Far East and the Islamic world produced minds as intelligent and curious as those of Europe. However, between 1500 and 1950, they did not produce anything that comes even close to Newtonian physics or Darwinian biology. What forged the historical bond between modern science and European imperialism? Technology was an important factor in the 19th and 20th centuries, but in the early modern era it was of limited importance. The key factor was that plant-seeking botanists and colony-seeking naval officers shared a similar mindset. Both scientist and conqueror began by admitting ignorance. They both said, "I don't know what's out there." They both felt compelled to go out and make new discoveries, and they both hoped that new knowledge, thus acquired, would make them masters of the world. Unquote. And lastly, we will talk about how the system of credit, investment and credit, and so capitalism emerged. So Harari says that the conquest of the world on credits appeared in the modern era, with the appearance of a new system based on trust in the future, as we said earlier with the agricultural revolution, the notion of planning ahead, right? So in this new based trust in the future, people agreed to represent imaginary goods, goods that do not exist in the present, with a special kind of money they called credit. Credit enables us to build the present at the expense of the future. It's founded on the assumption that our future resources are sure to be far more abundant than our present resources. A host of new and wonderful opportunities open up if we can build things in the present using future income. If credit is such a wonderful thing, why did nobody think of it earlier? Of course they did. Credit arrangements of one kind or another have existed in all known human cultures, going back to at least ancient Sumer. The problem in previous eras was not that one had the idea or knew how to use it. It was that people seldom wanted to extend much credit because they did not trust that the future would be better than the present. They generally believed that times past had been better than their own times and that the future would be worse, or at best, much the same. To put that in economic terms, they believed that the total amount of wealth was limited, if not dwindling. People therefore considered it a bad bet to assume that they personally, or their kingdom, or the entire world, would be producing more wealth 10 years down the line. Business looked like a zero-sum game. Of course, the profits of one particular bakery might rise, but only at the expense of the bakery next door. Venice might flourish, but only by impoverishing Genoa. The King of England might enrich himself, but only by robbing the King of France. You could cut the pie in many different ways, but it never got any bigger. That's why many cultures concluded that making bundles of money was sinful. As Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That's in Matthew. If the pie is static, and I have a big part of it, then I must have taken somebody else's slice. The rich were obliged to do penance for their evil deeds by giving some of their surplus wealth to charity. Parenthesis here, if you remember what we said about philanthropy activities in the USA, right, with Bill Gates and such. Then came the scientific revolution and the idea of progress. The idea of progress is built on the notion that if we admit our ignorance and invest resources in research, things can improve. The idea was soon translated into economic terms. Whoever believes in progress believes that geographical discoveries, technological inventions, and organizational developments can increase the sum total of human production, trade, and wealth. New trade routes in the Atlantic could flourish without ruining old routes in the Indian Ocean. New goods could be produced without reducing the production of old ones. For instance, one could open a new bakery specializing in chocolate, cakes, and croissants without causing bakeries specializing in bread to go bust. Everybody would simply develop new tastes and eat more. I can be wealthy without your becoming poor. I can be obese without your dying of hunger. The entire global pie can grow. And so can our consumption. Last paragraph and then we're done. Over the last 500 years, the idea of progress convinced people to put more and more trust in the future. This trust created credit. Credit brought real economic growth, and growth strengthened the trust in the future and opened the way for even more credit. It didn't happen overnight. The economy behaved more like a roller coaster than a balloon. But over the long run, with the bumps evened out, the general direction was unmistakable. Today, there is so much credit in the world that governments, business, corporations, and private individuals easily obtain large, long-term and low-interest loans that far exceed current income. Alright, so I think with this reading we just did and looking at Lord Bacon's legacy, we have covered succinctly maybe, but we have seen the major points, the key elements to take away from this notion of scientific and industrial revolution. We have seen how it brought about capitalism, a new notion of happiness, and how we moved on from being Homo sapiens to Homo Economicus. And just a brief definition of the term Homo Economicus, which you can find on Wikipedia, is the portrayal of humans as agents who are constantly rational, narrowly self-interested, and who pursue their subjectively defined ends optimally. It is a word play on Homo sapiens used in some economic theories and in pedagogy. So it's basically the assumption of perfect rationality and pursuit of self-interest. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. Take care.